At dawn, Theodore Ashwood signed his name to a marriage contract he had not yet read, accepted a wife he had never met, and made one wish, the only wish he had allowed himself in 3 years, that whoever the woman waiting at the altar might prove to be, she would not look at him with pity. By 8 o'clock, the wish had been answered. The woman who walked the long aisle of St. Margaret by the Park was veiled in ivory silk so heavy that he could not see her face, only the shape of her. Taller than he had expected, narrower at the waist, her gloved hand resting on the bishop's sleeve with the steadiness of someone who had decided what she was about to do and had no intention of changing her mind. The sanctuary smelled of beeswax and the early hawthorn the gardener had cut at dawn and bound to the pew ends. Spring light fell through the east window in long, deliberate lines. He had been told, in the careful diplomatic phrasing his solicitor preferred when the truth was unpleasant, that his betrothed had been delayed by a disorder of the carriage. He had not been told, because no one in this church yet knew enough to tell him, that the woman in the carriage had not been Eliza Merritt at all. The Duke of Ashwood was 28 years old, broad-shouldered, his dark coat tailored to a width across the chest that made the fitting tailor whistle quietly through his teeth. And he held himself the way men do when they have already decided not to feel the next 10 minutes of their lives. He turned to face the aisle. The bishop's hand released the bride's gloved fingers. The bride's gloved fingers did not tremble. She stopped beside him. The veil shifted. Through the ivory silk, he caught the first impression of a jaw set very firm, and a mouth that was, against every instruction his pride was issuing, quite extraordinary. "Your Grace," she said. The voice was low, level, and entirely the wrong voice. He did not answer. The bishop, mercifully, had begun. He kept his eyes on the prayer book. He listened to the bride speak her vows in that grave, unfamiliar voice. He spoke his own. He felt the cold weight of the rings slide along his fourth finger as it changed from his own hand to hers. He signed the register, the great loops of his title across the parchment. The bride signed below him. He read the name twice before he understood what he was reading. Charlotte Merritt. Written in a hand he had never seen before, in ink so freshly dipped that one of the letters had not yet entirely dried. "What," he said very quietly, "have you done?" She lifted her veil. The face beneath it was not Eliza's pretty, restless prettiness. It was harder cut, paler, the eyes a clear and arresting grey. The hair had been pinned in a hurry. One strand of pale gold had escaped and was lying against her temple, as if it, too, had not entirely caught up with the morning's events. "I have married you," she said, "and I think, Your Grace, this part of the conversation is best continued elsewhere." The bishop, blinking pleasantly, was already turning to address the assembled witnesses. The witnesses, who included the Duke's solicitor, 2 cousins, a deaf great-aunt, and a man from the Land Commission who had been waiting all week to see Ashwood Park's affairs settled by sundown, applauded politely. The bride placed her hand on the Duke of Ashwood's sleeve. Her fingers were perfectly steady. His were not. "The carriage," she said gently, "is at the south door." He walked her down the aisle of St. Margaret by the Park as a man walks a length of rope above an unfamiliar drop. The hawthorn brushed his shoulder. The bishop beamed. The Land Commissioner inclined his head in approval. Outside, the morning had ripened into the kind of warm, glittering spring that promised everything and explained nothing. The carriage door closed behind them with a sound that, to Theodore Ashwood, ended one life and began another. And he did not know yet, none of them knew yet, which of the two was the one he had wished for. The carriage wheels caught the cobbles outside the lich gate, rocked once, and settled into the long pull northward up the village street. Through the small window, the morning unrolled itself. The white frontage of the inn, the brewer's cart already loading, the baker's boy with his tray balanced on the flat of his head, the spire of St. Margaret by the Park receding behind them in the bright spring air. The hedges on the far side of the village were full of nesting birds. The lambs in the upper paddock were calling. Beyond the orchard, the wide, low pastures of the Asherwood home farm ran south to the Lime Avenue and the great house. None of it noticed that anything in particular had occurred. She arranged her veil across her lap as if it were ordinary cloth. He waited for the carriage to begin moving. It began moving. "You will explain yourself," he said. "I will," she said, "but not in the next 5 minutes. In the next 5 minutes, you must arrive at Ashwood Park looking like a man whose wedding has not been derailed. The Land Commissioner is in the carriage behind us, Your Grace, and his report goes to London tomorrow morning. If he sees you uncertain, he will write the report his cousin has been begging him to write." He was silent for a long moment. "Where," he said finally, "is Eliza?" "By now," said the woman who was apparently his wife, "I should think she is somewhere on the road to Dover. She left her note on the dressing table at 5:30. "With whom?" "With her music master. She has been planning it, I think, since November. She did not, in fact, intend to marry you. She intended for someone to marry you in her place. I happen to be that someone." He absorbed this. The carriage rocked over the gatepost stones. Through the small window he could see the Land Commissioner's vehicle keeping discreet pace behind. "And the someone," he said, "would be?" "Charlotte Merritt, her cousin. I lived in her father's house from the time I was 15, when my own father, Captain Merritt, could no longer afford a London season for either of his daughters, and Eliza's father offered to take me in. I've known Eliza since we were children. I am, you may have noticed, considerably less decorative than she is." "You are also," he said, "considerably less the woman I asked for." "Yes," she said, with a small, dry inclination of her head. "I imagine I am. I will not pretend that this is what was promised to you. It is, however, what has actually occurred. And, Your Grace, when one finds one's house on fire, one does not first inquire whether the rain is the rain one specifically requested." She had clear, level eyes, and a way of speaking that landed each word the way a competent woman places a teacup, exactly where she meant it, with no more force than necessary. He found that he could not quite keep his composure for a full second after she finished a sentence. "My estate," he said, "depended on that contract." "I know." "My tenants depended on that contract." "I know." The carriage settled into its long, northward pull. The morning country slid past the small window in successive frames, a stand of beech in new coppery leaf, a flock of clean-washed sheep moving slowly across a chalk hillside, a pond the colour of new pewter, with a single heron standing in it, a field of winter wheat that had risen, in the past warm fortnight, to the height of a man's knee. The great, cushioned door beside Theodore's elbow held him steady through the small bumps. The new gold band on his fourth finger caught the light at every turn of the carriage and surprised him each time, as if it had been placed there by a stranger. Somewhere behind, the Land Commissioner's vehicle rattled discreetly. Somewhere ahead, his own house. Between the two, on the seat opposite, the woman who had married him sat very still in her ivory silk, and breathed quietly, and waited. "You have," he said carefully, "involved yourself in something whose consequences you cannot possibly understand." She turned to look at him fully for the first time. The grey eyes were not angry. They were exact. "Your Grace," she said, "I have spent the past 3 days reading the contract you signed this morning. I read it twice. I copied the schedule of your debts. I drew up, in my own hand, in the ledger book I found on the desk in your solicitor's anteroom, a 6-month plan for resolving the Brackmore lien before it triggers. I am, on a great many subjects, ignorant. On this particular subject, I am not." "Why?" he said, after a silence. "Did you do it?" She did not look away, but she did not answer. "I will have an answer," he said. "You will have several answers, in time," she said. you will not have all of them this morning. This morning you will have a wife, a manageable scandal, and the Land Commissioner's report. That is, I think, more than most men receive from a single day's work. The carriage turned out of the village road and onto the long gravel drive of Asherwood Park. Beyond the lime avenue, the great house rose grey and stately against the glittering spring sky. He had ridden up this drive 10,000 times in his life. He had never ridden up it married before. She glanced once at the house. Her composure flickered for the fraction of a second. Not pity, not awe. Something quieter and more difficult. And then resettled. "Your Grace," she said, "if it would help, you might consider this. I did not steal anything from you that you had been promised. I stole an opportunity to fail. You are still very much in danger of failing. I have simply made certain you fail with company." He looked at her. She had a face that, in any other circumstance, he would have wished to look at again at a slightly slower pace. "Charlotte," he said, the first time he said the name. He did not know yet that the name would alter the shape of the rest of his life. "Yes?" "Walk in beside me, as if you have done this every day for a year." "I am quite capable of that, Your Grace." "Stop calling me Your Grace." "Yes," she said. "All right." The carriage stopped. The footman opened the door. Charlotte Merritt, now, by the stroke of her own pen at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning in spring, the Duchess of Asherwood, laid her gloved hand once again on her husband's sleeve, lifted her chin to exactly the angle a duchess's chin is meant to occupy, and walked into Asherwood Park, as if the house and everything in it had been waiting for her since the day it was built. Mrs. Penny, the housekeeper, was waiting in the great hall with the keys. Mrs. Penny was the kind of woman who had managed 5 dukes in her lifetime, and had developed certain firm convictions about what dukes required, what duchesses required, and what should under no circumstances be permitted to enter the linen cupboard. She was small, square, 63, and famously indifferent to surprise. She did not blink at the unfamiliar bride. She inclined her head a precise 1/4 of an inch, which, from Mrs. Penny, was the equivalent of a tearful welcome, and held out the chatelaine of keys. "Your Grace," she said to Charlotte, "the morning room is laid for breakfast. The Land Commissioner will be shown to the library. Cook would like to know whether to send up the salmon for luncheon or hold it back for dinner. There is also a small matter of a leak in the gallery, which I have not troubled you with on account of the wedding, but which I should be glad to mention now, if it is convenient." Charlotte accepted the keys without flinching. Theodore watched her test the weight of them in her palm. The brass cool, the iron heavy, the small enamelled fob bearing the Asherwood crest worn pale by 100 years of housekeeper's fingers. And then close her hand around them, as if she had carried such a weight all her life. "It is convenient, Mrs. Penny," she said. "Send up the salmon. The leak in the gallery may wait until after luncheon. I shall look at it with you myself." "Yes, Your Grace." "And Mrs. Penny?" "Your Grace?" "My trunk will arrive by the 10:30 coach. Please put it in the smaller chamber of the south wing, not the Duchess's apartments. The smaller chamber." There was a pause. Mrs. Penny's small black eyes flicked, with the speed of a hawk noticing a movement in the grass, from the new Duchess to the Duke, and back again. Whatever Mrs. Penny had thought to herself, and she would later, in the housekeeper's room, allow that she had thought a great deal, she said only, "Yes, Your Grace." She turned and went, the keys gone from her belt for the first time in 22 years, and a softness in the set of her shoulders that the new Duchess, busy unpinning her veil, did not see. Theodore did. He had known Mrs. Penny since he was 4 years old. Mrs. Penny's shoulders did not soften for nothing. "The smaller chamber," he said, when they were alone in the morning room. "I am not yet your wife in any sense that requires the Duchess's apartments, Your Grace." "Stop calling me Your Grace." "Theodore," she said, testing it the way a woman might test the temperature of bath water. "It does not yet sit, but I shall arrive at it." The land commissioner was admitted to the library at 10. Charlotte sat at the Duke's right hand. She poured the coffee. She answered, before Theodore could open his mouth, 3 quick technical questions about the harvest forecast for Ashwood's south fields. She did so accurately. The land commissioner, an elderly gentleman with a habit of polishing his spectacles whenever he was surprised, polished them 3 times in 20 minutes. He left at 11:30 a satisfied man. The report he wrote that evening, in the inn at Pulborough, described the Duchess of Ashwood as a young woman of considerable composure and a marked grasp of her husband's affairs, and recommended no further investigation. Theodore stood at the window, watching the commissioner's carriage rattle away down the drive. Charlotte stood at the breakfast table, picking up the scattered papers as if she had been doing it for a decade. He said her name. She answered without looking up from the scattered papers, as if she had been answering to it for a year, rather than a quarter of an hour. He observed then that she had known the harvest figures, exactly to the bushel, and asked her how. She said, simply, that she had read the bailiff's report at 3 o'clock that morning in the room where she dressed. The bailiff had left a copy on Eliza's writing desk. Eliza, of course, had not read it. He repeated the time of the morning back to her. He did not entirely believe it. "Theodore," she said, almost gently, looking up at last, "I was about to marry a stranger and step into the management of an estate that 24 hours from now might not exist. I was not, in the circumstances, especially sleepy." He stared at her. She did not look at him. She straightened the papers, set them in a neat pile, weighted them with a small brass paperweight in the shape of a hare, and turned for the door. "I shall go now," she said, "to look at Mrs. Penny's leak in the gallery. There is, I expect, much for both of us to do." She paused at the door. "Theodore." "Yes." "I am sorry that the woman you wished for did not come to your altar this morning. I am sorrier than I can yet tell you. But I will not be sorry tomorrow, and I will not be sorry the day after that, because tomorrow Ashwood Park will still be standing, and the day after that your tenants will still have roofs. I cannot give you what you wished for. I can give you what you actually require. Whether you find that an acceptable substitute is, of course, for you to decide." She closed the door behind her with the same exactness with which she had signed her name an hour and a half earlier in the church register at St. Margaret by the Park. Theodore Ashwood stood alone in the morning room of the only house he had ever loved, and for the first time in 3 years, he discovered that he had no idea what he wished for at all. Lord Quentin Brackmore arrived for dinner unannounced. He was Theodore's distant cousin on the mother's side, 29 years old, thinly elegant, and the second name in the line of succession to Ashwood Park. He had ridden over in the soft spring evening with a posy of late primroses, an engraved congratulations card he had had printed 3 weeks in advance, and the unhurried air of a man who has put a great deal of money into a horse he intends very shortly to win. He was beautiful in the way of men who have spent a great deal on tailoring, and a great deal more on never appearing to. His linen was very white, his coat the precise indigo of a kingfisher's wing, his smile arranged at the corners like a piece of Sèvres porcelain, but one did not wish to handle without gloves. "My dear cousin," he said in the great hall, and bowed over Charlotte's hand with the reverence of a man laying a wreath. "I am desolated to have missed the ceremony. Desolated. I had only this morning learned of the change of bride, and I confess I rode over half mad with curiosity to make the acquaintance of my new cousin. May I say—" He straightened, and held her grey eyes for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "That you appear, dear Duchess, in considerably better health than I had been led to expect." Charlotte received the primroses with grave courtesy. "You are very kind, Lord Brackmore. We shall be glad of your company at dinner." "I am all anticipation." He turned then to Theodore. He smiled. The smile reached his eyes the way frost reaches a window pane. "Cousin," he said, "I bring my warmest, fondest, most heartfelt congratulations." "You are too generous, Quentin," said Theodore, who had loathed his cousin since the age of 7 for reasons too detailed to be enumerated by dinner. They went in to dinner. Mrs. Penny had set 6 covers. The 4 guests Theodore had invited a week ago had, with the practical instincts of country gentry, absented themselves on 3 different excuses upon hearing of the morning's irregularity. 2 covers were therefore removed. The remaining diners, Duke, Duchess, and Lord Brackmore, sat in elegant geometric isolation along the great oak table, and the soup was served. Lord Brackmore said many charming things. He admired the silver. He admired the spring asparagus. He admired the Duchess's dress, a high-waisted gown of deep amber silk, hastily borrowed from Eliza's wardrobe, but expertly fitted by the undermaid in the half-hour after their arrival, and made it understood, in the way of a man who has practiced the art for years, that his admiration was not entirely directed at the silk. Charlotte ate. Theodore watched. Halfway through the second course, Lord Brackmore laid down his fork. "Dear Duchess," he said, "I have been racking my brain for the place I have heard your name. Charlotte Merritt. Charlotte Merritt. I am quite certain it has been spoken in my hearing. Recently. Within the year. Was it perhaps at Lady Compton's at Christmas? Or, no. Was it Lockwood Hall? You did spend some time at Lockwood Hall, I believe, 5 years ago, did you not?" The candles had been lit. Their light fell across Charlotte's face. Theodore saw her hand, on the table beside her wineglass, tighten around the stem of a small silver fork, and then deliberately release it. "You are mistaken, Lord Brackmore," she said pleasantly. "I have never had the pleasure of staying at Lockwood Hall." "Are you sure? I could have sworn. Quite sure." "Strange. The mind plays tricks. Forgive me." He smiled. "I shall remember, sooner or later. I have an unforgiving memory for names." Theodore looked at his wife. His wife looked at her plate. After dinner, Lord Brackmore took his leave with extravagant warmth, kissed Charlotte's hand, declined the bed Theodore felt obliged to offer him, and rode away into the soft spring dusk on his beautiful, expensive horse, whistling an air that Theodore had not heard for 5 years, and could not, at the moment, place. Theodore closed the door of the great hall himself. He stood for a long moment with his hand on the iron latch. Then he went to find his wife. She was in the gallery, on her knees, with a candle in one hand and a cloth in the other, examining a stain on the floorboards beneath the leak Mrs. Penny had reported. The long gallery at Ashwood Park ran the full length of the western front, 68 feet of pale oak floor, 18 tall, north-facing windows, and the silent assembly of dukes and duchesses, whose painted faces had presided over the household since the reign of George I. By candlelight, in the late spring evening, the gallery was at its most secret. The portraits, half lit by the single flame Charlotte had carried up from the staircase landing, watched the new Duchess work with the painted impassiveness of people who had seen many young women kneel on this floor, and would, in due course, see many more. The leak above had soaked through 3 boards. The pewter dish into which the rain dropped, drop by drop, gave back a small, clean, musical sound at intervals of almost exactly 4 seconds. Through the long windows, the homewood, dark against a thinning sky, showed the first powdery stars. The candle burned steadily. Charlotte's gold hair, half-pinned, caught the light in a small bright crescent at the nape of her neck. Her cloth moved on the boards in unhurried, patient circles. She had not yet noticed Theodore in the doorway. "Charlotte." "Theodore?" She did not look up. "It is the lead flashing on the parapet. I will send up to Pulborough tomorrow for the slater." "You have stayed at Lockwood Hall?" A pause. The candle did not waver. The cloth in her hand finished what it was doing. "I have," she said. "You denied it to a man you do not know." "I denied it to a man I do not trust. There is a difference." "You denied it to a man at my dinner table, in my house, within an hour of becoming my wife." She set the candle down on the floor. She turned and looked up at him, kneeling, in the soft amber gown, her pale gold hair half-pinned and falling. She was at that moment so unexpectedly beautiful, that Theodore Asherwood lost the next sentence he had been about to speak. "Theodore," she said, "I will tell you about Lockwood Hall. I will tell you about a great many things. I will not be hurried into telling you in a hallway. May I ask you to wait until tomorrow morning?" "Until tomorrow morning?" "Yes." He looked down at her. She looked up at him. The leak in the slates above them dripped, very softly, into a pewter dish that the new Duchess had carried up from the kitchen herself and placed under the worst of the damage. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "In the library. After breakfast." "Yes." He turned to go. "Theodore." He turned back. "I am not your enemy." He stood with his hand on the gallery door for a long moment. "That," he said, "remains to be determined." He left her in the gallery with the candle, and the cloth and the dish that caught the rain, and went down to his study to drink one glass of brandy and stare at the unsigned letter from the Brackmore Leanholders that had been sitting on his desk for 11 days. He did not read it. He had read it many times. He turned instead to a small drawer he had not opened for 5 years, and from it took out a single faded card, on which was written, in a hand he had once known very well, "To His Grace the Duke of Asherwood, in remembrance of one September afternoon at Lockwood. C.M." He read it 3 times. He folded the card very carefully and put it back in the drawer. He went to bed in the Duke's apartments. Charlotte slept, presumably in the smaller chamber of the south wing. The dower house lay dark across the lawn, under a thin spring moon. Somewhere in the home wood, an owl called twice, quite slowly, and was answered by another, further off. He did not sleep for a long while. The Duke's apartments at Ashwood Park had been hung, 3 generations earlier, with a heavy ivory damask that had faded in patches to the colour of old cream, and the canopy of the great bed bore at its centre a small embroidered acorn that he had counted, as a boy, every summer night his mother had brought him in to wish his father good night. He counted it again, now. He thought about a card in a drawer. He thought about a voice in an orangery he had not allowed himself to remember. He thought, more than he wished to, about a hand he had touched in the lane, and the small, loose strand of pale gold hair that had caught on the back of his thumb. The owl called once more. He turned over. In the morning the gardener would cut more hawthorn, and the leak in the slates would be assessed, and a duke would discover that his memory was either better or worse than he had believed, and he could not yet say which. The library was full of light when she came in. She had changed into a morning dress of clear pale green, the colour of the first leaves on the limes outside the window. Her hair had been pinned more carefully this time. Her eyes were the same level grey, the same exact grey, that Theodore had been carrying behind his eyelids since the candle in the gallery the night before. He stood at the window. He turned when she entered. He did not invite her to sit. "You will explain Lockwood Hall," he said. "I will," she said. "I will also, with your permission, explain rather more than that." She crossed the room and stood beside the window, in the early sun, at a sufficient distance from him that the conversation could be held in level voices. "I was 21 years old," she said. "My father, Captain Merritt, had retired upon a small pension. He had no son. He had 2 daughters and a niece, myself, for whom no provision could be afforded. A friend of my father, a Mrs. Vaughan Pell, took me into her household at Lockwood Hall as a companion to her elderly mother. I went there in May. I left at the end of September. 5 years ago. 5 years ago. At the end of September. Yes. He waited. She did not look away. "You were there for 2 days," she said. "You came in a riding party from the Cotswolds. You stayed Friday and Saturday. You left Sunday. On the Saturday afternoon, I had been sent to the orangery to find a particular book that Mrs. Vaughan Pell's mother could not eat her supper without. You were standing in the orangery, with your back to the door, looking at a lemon tree as if it had personally insulted you. I asked you whether you would prefer me to come back later. And I? You said no. You said you were considering whether to write to your father about a debt of conscience you had incurred at Cambridge, and could not, with honour, leave unpaid. You did not know who I was. I did not introduce myself. You spoke for perhaps 20 minutes. I do not believe you intended to. You did not know me. I did not know you. We had between us only that one afternoon, in the orangery at Lockwood, when you needed someone to listen to you, and I was, by accident, that someone. She paused. I have remembered every word of it. You have not, I think, remembered that it occurred at all. The library at Ashwood Park was a long room of pale oak panelling, 3 tall south-facing windows, and walls lined to the ceiling with the books a previous duke had collected on the architecture of Italian villas, the husbandry of sheep, and the management of inherited debt. The early sun, falling through the centre window, lay across the carpet in 3 long, warm rectangles. A small porcelain dish on the table between them held 2 pressed primroses Mrs. Penny had brought out the previous afternoon. Outside, a robin was working its careful way along the gravel walk. Further off, a horse in the home paddock whinnied once, and was answered by another. The first leaves on the limes against the window had begun, in the night, to come into their true colour. The whole room smelled of wax polish, last winter's wood smoke, and the cool, clean air of a window that had been opened, for the first time that year, an hour before. He said nothing for a moment. "Charlotte," he said, "I remembered it last night." She closed her eyes for the briefest moment. When she opened them, they were wet and entirely composed. "I sent you a card," she said, "after, with my initials, C.M. I did not put my full name. I did not expect a reply. I did not receive one. I did not blame you for not replying. You were a stranger. I was less than a stranger. I sent it because I did not wish to forget what it had felt like to be—" She did not finish the sentence. "To be—" "Spoken to," she said, "as though I were a person." The sun moved a little. The pale green of her gown caught it. Theodore Asherwood, 28 years old and accustomed to the management of 17 tenant farms, could not for a moment locate the breath he had been holding. "Charlotte, the contract was for Eliza." "Yes. You stepped into Eliza's place because of an afternoon in an orangery 5 years ago." "No," she said. "I stepped into Eliza's place because if she did not marry you, the Brackmore lien would foreclose within 7 days, and the Brackmore inheritance clause would dissolve a small allowance paid out of the Asherwood estate to a man named Captain Charles Merritt of Petworth, who is my father, and who would, without that allowance, lose the cottage in which he has lived for 11 years. I stepped into Eliza's place because if Asherwood Park went to Quentin Brackmore, my father would be in the workhouse by Michaelmas. I had Sunday morning, when Eliza's note was found, to decide whether to let that happen. I decided not to." A pause. "The orangery," she said, "made it easier to sign my name. It did not make me sign it." He looked at her. He looked at the green leaves on the limes outside the window, just beginning to come into their first true colour. "You married me to save your father." "I married you to save my father, and, incidentally, your tenants, and possibly you. I will not pretend the orangery had nothing to do with it. It would be a lie. I am not in the habit of lying except when a Lord Brackmore invites me to confess a connection between us at a dinner table within his hearing." He knew about Lockwood. "He has been making inquiries. For weeks, I think. He cannot be permitted to know that I knew you before yesterday. He will use it. He will use it in any way he can. It must be, between us, a secret." "It will be." "Thank you." She did not move. He did not move. The library smelled of leather and beeswax, and the faint, sweet greenness of cut hawthorn that Mrs. Penny, with infallible instinct, had set in a brown jug on the mantelpiece. "I owe you an apology," he said. "For what?" "For not replying to your card. You did not know who I was." "That is not the apology I owe you." She did not, this time, answer. He saw her lips part very slightly and then close again. He saw the small, tight movement at her throat as she swallowed. "Charlotte," he said, "will you walk with me, after breakfast, down to the Dower House? I should like to show you what we are about to ask the architect to do." "Yes," she said. "I should be glad of the walk." Outside the library window, the gardener was in the lime avenue, bareheaded, picking the new green into his basket. The sky over the southern downs was a clear, expectant blue. Spring at Asherwood Park had begun. For 3 weeks, they did not stop working. The leak in the gallery was repaired. The Brackmore lien was rescheduled, painfully, in 3 meetings with 3 solicitors, 2 of whom Charlotte was on first-name terms with by the end of the first hour. The Dower House, empty since Theodore's mother had left it for the Great House 20 years ago, its garden a tangle of bramble and ivy, was opened, swept, surveyed, and entered into the family ledger as the next of the estate's rebuilding projects. Charlotte and Theodore walked out to it every morning, in the slow, widening warmth of the spring, and stood among the weeds discussing the shape of the garden it was to become. They did not touch. They had not touched in any way that mattered since the carriage door had closed behind them on the morning of the wedding. They worked, side by side, and slept in separate chambers, and learned each other's habits as people learn the route of a daily walk. The way Theodore drank his coffee black and standing up. The way Charlotte ate breakfast with a book open beside her and read 3 sentences between each bite. The way he came in from a tenant visit with mud halfway up his boots. And the way she came down from the gallery with brick dust on the hem of her gown and never seemed to mind. The tenants accepted her with the cautious, swift practicality of country people. The bailiff, a grim old man named Mr. Hoyt, who had served Theodore's father, recommended her after 11 days as a sound enough head for a duchess. The undermaids, who had been prepared to disapprove of any woman who arrived without notice, reported in the housekeeper's room that the new Her Grace had asked their Christian names and remembered them, and did not ring the bell unless she required something she could not obtain by walking down to the kitchen herself. Mrs. Penny, who had thought a great deal, had stopped thinking, and now said only of an evening, "She'll do," which was, from Mrs. Penny, the equivalent of a 14-stanza ode. The spring widened around them. The hedgerows on the South Drive thickened week by week with the sharp green of new hawthorn leaf. The cuckoo arrived in the home wood on the 2nd Friday of April and announced itself with monotonous satisfaction every dawn thereafter. The east lawn, which had been brown and matted in the first week, lifted itself into a thick, soft green that the gardener mowed once and then left, on the Duchess's instruction, alone, so that the buttercups might be permitted to come up where they wished. Lambing in the high paddock concluded. Carving in the low pasture began. The estate, slowly and unevenly, with many small reverses and many smaller mendings, began to hold itself upright again. The Duke and Duchess, walking the long line of the south wall every morning at 7:30 before breakfast, learned to recognize each other's silences as accurately as they had begun to recognize each other's habits. The barn at Hollow Field flooded on the 3rd Tuesday. It was a soft, warm rain that had begun before dawn and had continued through the afternoon, and Hollow Field, low-lying, ill-drained, the responsibility of every duke since 1734 to remedy, and the achievement of none, had risen up over the threshold of its barn by tea-time. 16 lambs were inside. So was the year's seed corn. The tenant farmer, a wiry man named Coles, came up to the great house in his shirt-sleeves at 4:20 to ask if his grace might possibly, if not pressingly engaged, lend a hand. His grace was pressingly engaged in a meeting with the Pulborough Slater. He left the meeting. Charlotte, who had been standing at the window watching the rain, took her green cloak from its peg without asking permission, and walked behind him to the stables. "Charlotte," he said, swinging into the saddle, "there is no need." "There is every need," she said. She climbed onto the second horse with the practical ease of a woman who had ridden before she had learned to embroider. You will need someone to count the lambs while you and Coles move the seed. He did not argue. He had learned in 3 weeks not to argue with Charlotte about questions of practical necessity. They rode down the lane together in the warm, grey rain. The hawthorn in the hedges was full out now, white as new linen, and the petals fell against Charlotte's hair and stayed there. Coles ran beside them on his own pony, talking through the situation in short, urgent bursts. The barn was up to a foot of water inside the door. The lambs, in the highest manger, were complaining loudly but unharmed. The seed sacks on the stone floor were beginning to darken. Theodore swung down, threw his coat across the gate, and was inside the barn within the minute, lifting the first sack onto his shoulder. Charlotte pinned her gown above her ankles, took the lantern Coles handed her, climbed onto the manger rail, and counted lambs. 16. She named them, as she counted, after Roman senators, because the under-shepherd's small daughter Bess, who had come up the lane in a sack apron with her bare feet pink from the rain, had asked her once, 3 days earlier, what she would name a lamb if she were the empress, and Charlotte had been thinking about it ever since. Cicero, Cato, Catullus, Cassius. No, that one is a girl. Scrub Cassius. Cornelia, Calpurnia. Charlotte, Theodore said from the floor of the barn, water to his knees, the third sack up. Are you naming my lambs after Romans? I am. They are not Roman lambs. They are now. Bess, on the threshold, with her serious round face streaming with rain, said, Sextus? Sextus, Charlotte said gravely. Excellent. We have been wanting a sextus. Theodore, hauling the fourth sack out of the rising water, made a small sound at the back of his throat, but was the first laugh anyone at Ashwood Park had heard from him in 3 years. It took an hour and 40 minutes to clear the barn. By the end of it, Theodore had ruined a coat, a pair of boots, and the white shirt that had cost his man a quarter of an hour's complaint at the breakfast table, and Charlotte had a long muddy streak across her cheek and a piece of straw stuck in her pinned hair. The seed was safe in Coles's loft. The lambs, with much indignation, had been driven to the high paddock, where Sextus had immediately found a puddle and lain down in it. They walked back up the lane in the early evening, the rain finally slacking, the sky over the downs broken open into long ribbons of pale and vivid gold. Coles had been left with a half-sovereign for new seed sacks and warm thanks. The 2 horses walked behind them, the bridles trailing. Charlotte. Theodore. You have straw in your hair. I am aware. I shall remove it when I reach a mirror. May I? She stopped walking. He took the piece of straw from her hair. His knuckles brushed her temple. The gold strand that had escaped its pin 5 seconds before. She had pinned and repinned that strand a dozen times in 3 weeks, caught on the back of his thumb. He did not at once draw his hand back. She did not at once step away. They stood in the lane in the slackening rain. The hawthorn in the hedge above them was so heavy with flower that the smallest movement spilled white petals onto her shoulder and his sleeve. She breathed once. He breathed once. Neither spoke. He drew his hand back. She took a small step. They walked the rest of the way to the great house in silence, and when they reached the gravelled sweep at the front steps, Mrs. Penny was already in the doorway with hot tea and warm towels, and behind her the gallery clock, which had not struck the hour correctly since 1809, chimed 7, 6, 5, 3, and then, after a thoughtful pause, 2 more. Mrs. Penny, Charlotte said, climbing the steps, we must do something about that clock. Yes, Your Grace. Tomorrow. Yes, Your Grace. Theodore, behind her, did not say anything. He was occupied with the question of why the small touch of his knuckles to her temple had caused him to lose, for a measurable and disorienting interval, the use of his lungs. He went up to change for dinner. He stood for a long moment at the window of the Duke's apartments, looking down at the dower house across the lawn. He had not, in 28 years, been in any difficulty he could not name. He named this one, slowly and without pleasure, while the valet brushed his ruined coat, and the rain finally stopped over the South Downs. Lord Brackmore returned to Ashwood Park on the first warm Thursday in May. He came in his curricle, alone, at the unfashionable hour of 11 in the morning, when Theodore was out at the South Fields with the bailiff, and Charlotte was in the dower house with the gardener, kneeling on a folded sack in a tangle of last year's brambles, sketching in pencil the line where the new lavender hedge would run. The gardener saw the curricle first. He straightened. He said mildly, "Your Grace, the gentleman." Charlotte looked up. Lord Brackmore was already crossing the rough grass toward her, with the unhurried elegance of a man who has been informed that he is not expected, and intends to make full use of the information. His cream-coloured riding coat was without speck. His smile was without warmth. "My dear cousin Duchess," he said when he reached her, "forgive the intrusion. I was in the neighbourhood. I thought I might call." She rose. She did not offer her hand. "You are most welcome, Lord Brackmore. The Duke is at the South Fields. I shall have a man sent for him at once." "Pray do not. Pray do not. I have come to speak with you. Privately, if you can spare the time." The gardener, glancing from one to the other, picked up his trowel and removed himself with admirable speed to the far end of the wall. Charlotte folded the pencil into the sketchbook. "Speak, Lord Brackmore." "Cousin," he said, "I shall be brief, because I have always preferred brevity to its alternative. I have made certain inquiries. I have found certain papers. I have, in short, established beyond reasonable doubt, but the woman my cousin Ashwood married 3 weeks ago was not the woman to whom he was betrothed, and was not the woman whose dowry his contract specified. The contract, in consequence, is technically void. The Brackmore lien stands as it stood on Monday morning. I am, technically, entitled to commence foreclosure proceedings as early as next Tuesday, at which point the estate passes to me. I am sure you follow." She did not flinch. "I follow. I do not, however, wish to commence such proceedings. No. No. They would be tedious. They would be expensive. They would expose certain inconveniences in my own affairs, which I should much prefer not to expose. I am a man, dear Duchess, of negotiation." "Are you?" "I am. I therefore offer you a private accommodation. You will, this evening, agree with my cousin Ashwood that the marriage was made under fraudulent circumstances. You will withdraw quietly to your father's cottage. The marriage will be annulled. My cousin will then marry, within a reasonable interval, a lady of my choosing, with a dowry I shall make available, and Ashwood Park will be saved by the very man who has spent the past 3 years undermining it. He will, in time, thank me. You may be paid an annuity of £200 a year for your trouble. It is, I believe, a generous offer." Charlotte studied him. She was, Theodore would later observe, when she gave him the report of this conversation, perfectly still, her hands folded over the sketchbook, her grey eyes the level grey he was beginning to know. "Lord Brackmore." "Yes, dear cousin." "Your offer is exactly as generous as I had been led, by your conduct at our dinner table, to expect it would be. I am gratified that you find it adequate." "I do not find it adequate. I find it interesting. I shall, if I may, decline." The smile froze. "You decline?" "I decline. I shall mention this conversation to my husband at luncheon. I shall mention it to our solicitor on Monday. I shall mention it, should you continue to make inquiries about my person and my history, to the magistrate at Petworth, who has been my father's friend for 16 years. I shall not be paid £200. I shall not withdraw. I shall not, I think, be married off again to suit your purposes. You may try the foreclosure. You will find that the lien, as I think you know perfectly well, requires a court hearing that cannot reasonably be summoned before September. Between this morning and September, a great many things may happen." "Cousin." "Yes?" "I do not advise you to make an enemy of me. Lord Brackmore, she said, you have been my enemy since the moment you understood that I was not Eliza. I have not made you anything. I have merely declined the privilege of being purchased. There was a pause. You will regret this, he said, possibly. I am, however, accustomed to regret. It is one of the more reliable sentiments. Good morning. He bowed. The bow was not a polite one. He turned. He walked back across the rough grass to his curricle. The gardener, watching from the far wall, expectorated thoughtfully into the brambles. The horses departed at a smart trot. Charlotte did not immediately sit down. She stood among the weeds of the Dower House garden in her clear, pale green morning dress, the pencil still in her hand, and looked at the line where the lavender hedge would, in time, grow. The line wavered slightly. She corrected it on the page. She had not, until that moment, allowed herself to consider that she might in fact lose. She considered it now, briefly, and then put it away. The wall behind her was warm with May sunlight, and the rough mortar pressed faintly against her shoulder blades, through the thin, pale green muslin of her gown. From beyond the wall, she could hear the murmur of the home wood, the soft, early summer continuo of wood pigeons in the high branches, and the small, dry clatter of the gardener's trowel reaching for stones in the brambles. A chaffinch, somewhere very near, sang its short, repeated phrase 3 times, and was answered distantly by another. Above the south gable of the Dower House, where the new lead flashing caught the noon light, a swallow turned twice and was gone. The pale petals of the late hawthorn, which had drifted across the kitchen garden wall all week, lay on the rough grass at her feet in a thin, uneven scatter. She took, slowly and without ceremony, 3 steady breaths, and arranged herself once more into the form of the woman who would now walk back across the lawn and tell her husband what had occurred, and what she proposed to do about it. She walked back to the great house. She told Mrs. Penny that the Duke was to be informed, on his return, that she required to speak with him in the library before luncheon. She took off her gardening apron. She washed her hands. By noon, she had told Theodore the entirety of the conversation. He had not, by the end of it, said a word. He stood with his back to the great window of the library. The May sunlight, falling across the carpet, had reached the toes of his boots and was working its slow, bright way up the line of his coat. When she finished, he turned to face her. You declined. I declined. He will retaliate. He will use Lockwood. He will try. Charlotte, I should have been there. You should not have had that conversation alone. I was not alone. The gardener was 20 feet away. He has known my father for 9 years. He would have come had I called. That is not what I meant. I know what you meant, she said, more gently. Theodore, I have been alone in conversations with men like Quentin Brackmore for most of my adult life. I do not mind being alone in them. I should mind very much, however, if you and I were to become alone in our conversations with each other. He looked at her for a long moment. What would you have me do? I would have you, she said. Let me handle Lord Brackmore. I've been thinking about him. I have ideas. I shall need 3 weeks. In the meanwhile... She paused. In the meanwhile? In the meanwhile, the Cavendish's ball at Hartfield House is on the 27th. We have been invited. I propose that we go. To London. To London. To stand together, in the most public room in England, with the entire Brackmore connection watching, and let him understand that he cannot frighten us into a corner. He is a man who lives by reputation. We shall give him a piece of reputation he has not bargained for. You wish to dance. I wish, she said, to walk in on your arm. I shall enjoy the dancing, if it occurs. She was, at that moment, very faintly smiling. Theodore Ashwood, 28, broad-shouldered, with his back to the great window on the May sunlight on his coat, looked at his wife, at the pale green of her gown, the level grey of her eyes, the small dry lift at the corner of her mouth, and discovered that he wished to do nothing in the world more than place his hands on her shoulders and say something he had not, in those 3 weeks, found a way to say. He said instead, "Then we shall go." "Thank you, Theodore." "And Charlotte." "Yes." "You will not, in future, take meetings with Quentin Brackmore without sending for me first." "I shall send for you." "Promise me." "I promise." "Thank you." She did not, that afternoon, smile again. She had a great deal to do. There were, after all, only 23 days until the Cavendish's ball, and the Duchess of Asherwood, having stepped into the role on a Tuesday morning without notice, and having held it now for very nearly a month, had as yet only the one ball gown, which had been borrowed, and which she had no intention of borrowing twice. The ball at Hartfield House was, by London standards, the third event of the season worth attending, and, by Quentin Brackmore's standards, the only event of the season at which a properly arranged humiliation could be given a sufficiently large audience. He had spent 11 days arranging it. He had written to 4 hostesses, 2 minor newspapers, and 1 well-known gossip whose Christian name he was on terms with, planting in each the seed of a suggestion that the new Duchess of Asherwood was, in fact, an opportunistic substitute, that the marriage had been made by trickery, that the late Eliza Merritt's elopement had been a desperate flight from a family of impostors. He had, more privately, persuaded Eliza herself, returned, husbandless, from a brief and disappointing tour of the continent with her music master, to accept the Cavendish invitation. He had paid for her gown. By 9:30 on the evening of the 27th of May, the principal staircase of Hartfield House was the most attentively watched piece of marble in London. Hartfield House had been built, at the end of the previous century, by a duke with more money than sense and an architect with more sense than scruple. The result was a ballroom of such extravagant proportions that the fashionable had agreed, by general consensus, to behave more discreetly inside it than outside. 3 crystal chandeliers, each as wide as a bedchamber, hung from the painted ceiling. The orchestra at the south end was hidden behind a pierced screen of gilded oak. The supper room, beyond the great arched doors, smelled of orange flowers and strawberries, and the cold beef the Cavendish's cook had been famous for since 1791. Every silk that mattered in London that May was somewhere on the floor or against the walls, and every face attached to a silk that mattered had turned, for half a heartbeat, toward the head of the staircase as the announcement was made. The Duke and Duchess of Asherwood were announced at 9:45. A short, reverberant silence fell across the head of the staircase as they appeared. Theodore was in deep evening blue, his linen white as paper, his hair newly cut, his height and breadth of shoulder noticeable from across 2 rooms. Charlotte was in a gown of ruby silk, chosen by Theodore himself in Bond Street 4 days earlier, after 20 minutes of unprecedented decisiveness, with the diamond drops of the Asherwood inheritance at her ears, and the great Asherwood pearl slung on a slender gold chain, lying at the precise hollow of her throat. She did not wear a single fashionable feather in her hair. She did not need one. She walked down the staircase on her husband's arm, with the steadiness she had walked down the aisle of St. Margaret by the Park, and 140 London personages watched her do it. She paused, halfway down. She placed her gloved hand on Theodore's sleeve. She turned her head slightly toward him and said something. Quite ordinary, quite domestic as it happened. She said, "The band is too loud." And Theodore Asherwood smiled at her, unaffectedly, with the warmth of a man smiling at his wife at the end of a comfortable day. And 140 London personages noticed. Lady Cavendish met them at the foot of the stairs. Lady Cavendish, who had read the gossip, who had heard the rumour, who had been told confidentially by 3 different persons that the new Duchess of Asherwood was an embarrassing makeshift, took one long look at the ruby silk and the grey eyes and the unaffected smile of the Duke, came to her own private conclusion, and welcomed Charlotte Asherwood into the ballroom with the warmth she normally reserved for daughters of her own. Quentin Brackmore saw the welcome from across the room. He set down his glass. The first half-hour proceeded as Lord Brackmore had intended it to proceed, in only one respect. Eliza Merritt, pale, beautifully gowned in primrose silk, a little thinner than Charlotte remembered her, was successfully introduced into Charlotte's path beside the supper-room door. "Cousin," Eliza said, with a small, breathless laugh. "Cousin, how extraordinary to see you here. How very—" "Eliza, you look so well. Is this Asherwood Pearl? Yes? I had thought it would be locked away. I had thought—" "Eliza," Charlotte said, gently, "you are speaking very fast. Take a breath. It is good to see you. I should have written. I was unforgivably busy. Will you walk in to supper with me?" Eliza, who had clearly been instructed to provoke a public scene, opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, and, lacking instructions for what to do with kindness, accepted the offered arm and allowed herself to be walked, mildly stunned, into the supper-room. Lord Brackmore, watching, drained his glass. He chose his moment carefully. He waited until after the supper interval. He waited until Charlotte was standing in the mirrored anteroom between two wide arched doors, in the precise place where the ballroom sound carried best. He waited until she was alone, Theodore 3 steps off, in conversation with the Earl of Pulborough. And then he came forward, smiling, with 2 friends, and made his bow. "Dear Duchess." "Lord Brackmore." "I have been wishing to speak to you all evening. There is a small matter, a very small matter, on which I crave your indulgence. A question, a trifle. I shall not detain you long." He raised his voice, very slightly. "Cousin, I was struck this evening, struck, I must say, with great admiration, by the resemblance of your portrait, which I observed last autumn in the orangery at Lockwood Hall, to the very face I now have the pleasure of addressing. It is a fine portrait, a small thing, hung above the lemon trees. I had been led to believe it was a niece of Mrs. Vaughan Pell, who summered at Lockwood the year my cousin Asherwood was riding through the Cotswolds. Was I mistaken? Was that not, perhaps, you?" Several conversations within hearing fell silent. A face turned, then another. The mirrored anteroom between the 2 arched doors was the most carefully designed acoustic accident at Hartfield House. The Cavendish architect, in 1797, had set the long pier glasses in such alignment that any voice raised above a half-whisper near the south arch carried, with theatrical clarity, to the supper-room beyond, and to the eastern half of the ballroom proper. Lord Brackmore had known this for 19 years. Charlotte had been told it by Lady Cavendish on the staircase. Theodore, 3 steps away in the press around the Earl of Pulborough, had felt, rather than heard, the conversational silence drop, the way one feels the wind change in a hedgerow before one hears the first leaves move. He turned his head. He saw the line of Lord Brackmore's shoulders. He did not yet move. Charlotte looked at Lord Brackmore for a long, very level moment. "You are not mistaken, Lord Brackmore," she said. Her voice was quiet, perfectly clear, and pitched precisely to carry. "It was indeed a portrait of me. I sat for it at Mrs. Vaughan Pell's request, in the September before her mother passed. Mrs. Vaughan Pell has been a benefactress of mine since my girlhood. I shall be glad to write to her tomorrow and tell her you admired it. She will be very gratified." Lord Brackmore's smile slipped half a degree. "And your acquaintance with the Duke? Did it date from that visit?" "The Duke and I," said Charlotte, lifting her chin, "had not the pleasure of being formally introduced until our wedding day. We had, however, been in the same drawing-rooms upon a number of occasions, as half the persons in this room have been, over the course of the past 5 years. Whether one chooses to call that an acquaintance, Lord Brackmore, depends, I suppose, on the standard of acquaintance to which one is accustomed." She inclined her head a precise 1/4 of an inch. "I imagine yours is high." A perfectly distinct ripple of suppressed laughter ran through the persons within hearing. Lord Brackmore's face went, for the briefest possible instant, the colour of cream cheese. Theodore, from 3 paces off, had heard it. He came forward. He laid his hand at the small of Charlotte's back, the gesture exact, unhurried, without aggression, with a clear public claim. He inclined his head to Lord Brackmore, with the courtesy a gentleman owes a kinsman in another man's house. "Quentin," he said, "I had not seen you. May I present you to my wife, the Duchess of Asherwood? Charlotte, you will recall I have spoken of my cousin Brackmore."
"I recall, Theodore."
"Lord Brackmore, Charlotte. There. Now we are all formally acquainted. I trust, cousin, you will spare us the inconvenience of being introduced again." Lord Brackmore smiled. It cost him visible effort. "I am at your service, Asherwood." "Excellent. The supper is, I am told, particularly fine. You should not stand here. Charlotte, my love, the Duchess of Devonshire wishes a word with you in the long gallery. Shall I take you?"
"Please."
He drew her away. They walked through the room together. Their progress, from the mirrored anteroom to the arched door of the long gallery, was the most attentively followed walk of the evening. And by the time they reached the gallery, the gossip in the supper room had reversed direction with the speed of wind on a hilltop. In the long gallery, beside the great window that looked down into the garden, lit with lanterns, Theodore stopped. "Charlotte."
"Yes?"
"You said it. You said the orangery."
"I said the portrait."
"There is no portrait."
"There will be," she said. "I sat for it, in fact, 11 days ago. I commissioned it from a Miss Linwood in Pulborough. It will hang in the orangery at Lockwood by the 3rd week of June. Mrs. Vaughan Pell has been, throughout, perfectly informed."
He stared at her.
"You commissioned a portrait?" "I commissioned a portrait. Theodore, I have been thinking about Lord Brackmore for 3 weeks. I have not been thinking about anything else."
He started to laugh. It was not a polite laugh. It was the wholly uncontrolled laugh of a man who has been carrying an iron weight for 3 weeks and has just been told, with no warning, that the weight was made of paper. He laughed so much that the Duchess of Devonshire, who genuinely did wish a word, raised her eyebrows pleasantly and allowed them another 5 minutes. "Charlotte."
"Yes?"
"You have been, for 3 weeks, 9 moves ahead of me."
11 moves, she said gravely. "But the others are not yet relevant."
He looked at her. The lantern light from the garden fell on her face, and the ruby silk and the pale gold of her hair. She was, at that moment, so entirely beautiful that he forgot, briefly, the long gallery, and the Cavendishes, and the Duchess of Devonshire, and Quentin Brackmore, and the 17 tenant farms. "Charlotte."
"Yes?"
"I am going to kiss you."
"Theodore."
"Not in the long gallery." "In the carriage, then?"
"Yes," she said, "in the carriage."
The Duchess of Devonshire was had. The remainder of the ball was endured. The Duke and Duchess of Asherwood took their leave at midnight, to a great many warm goodbyes, several of which had not been arranged in advance. Eliza Merritt, gathering up her primrose silk by the supper-room door, looked up as they passed and said, very softly,
"Charlotte, I am sorry."
"I know," Charlotte said. She paused. She set her hand briefly on her cousin's wrist.
"Eliza, write to me, properly. I shall write back."
She left her cousin where she had found her. She and her husband descended the steps of Hartfield House together. The carriage was waiting. The footman closed the door behind them. The horses moved off. He kissed her in the carriage, in the dark, very slowly, with the deliberation of a man who has been waiting 28 years for one particular moment, and has decided to spend it correctly. The pearl at her throat was warm against the back of his hand. The ruby silk made a sound against his coat that was scarcely a sound at all. She held the lapel of his evening blue with a grip he had not known her capable of, and made, once, a small sound of her own, but he resolved immediately he would spend the next 40 years trying to deserve. The carriage rocked westward across Berkeley Square and into the long, lamplit reach of Park Lane. Inside, the cushioned darkness held only the warm geometry of 2 people who had stopped, at last, holding themselves apart. Outside, London moved around them with the soft, late-night clatter of returning carriages, the call of a watchman 1 street over, the brief barking of a small dog,
and the distant, clear bell of St. George's beyond the park. The air through the carriage window smelled of new-leafed plane trees and the river beyond them, and the faint, sweet coal smoke of a city banking its fires for the night. The carriage turned out of Berkeley Square. The London streets were full of light and quiet movement. Inside the carriage, in the dark, Theodore Ashwood discovered that he had, in fact, been waiting for the woman he had wished for. He had merely been mistaken about her name. He drew back, eventually. Not far. His forehead rested against hers. Charlotte. Yes. I have something I wish to say to you. I shall not, however, say it in the carriage. No? No. I shall say it at home, in daylight, in the Dower House garden, with 3 months of building accounts in front of us and the gardener within shouting distance. I should like, when I say it to you, to be standing beside the lavender hedge that has not yet grown. Theodore. Yes. That is, I think, the most sensible romantic plan you have so far proposed. I am, occasionally, sensible. You are improving. He laughed again, more quietly. The carriage rolled on through London. They did not speak for a long time. Spring lay across the city, in soft, warm air, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, the Duke of Ashwood handed his Duchess down from the carriage at the front steps of his townhouse, and Mrs. Penny, who had travelled with them to London for the purpose of preserving propriety, and whose firm convictions had been audibly tried by the late hour, opened the door without comment, which was, from Mrs. Penny, an act of pure indulgence. They left London the morning after the ball, in the same blue travelling carriage in which Charlotte had arrived as a bride 7 weeks earlier, and rolled south through the long, warm, late-spring countryside towards Sussex. The hedges along the post road had thickened from the white hawthorn of April into the deeper greens of late May. The elder was beginning to flower at the verges. Small rivers, where the road crossed them, ran low and bright between banks already heavy with cow parsley. They stopped, as they had on the outward journey, at the inn at Cookfield to change horses. This time, the landlord came out himself to bow, having read in the morning's paper that the Duke and Duchess of Ashwood had been received with great warmth at the Cavendishes on the previous night, and the landlord's daughter brought a small jug of cowslips to the carriage door, which Charlotte received with a grave courtesy that the daughter would talk of for many years. They reached Ashwood Park at 4 in the afternoon. Mrs. Penny was on the gravel sweep with the keys. Mr. Hoyt was in the great hall with the week's accounts. The lambing returns from the high paddock were on the Duke's desk. The lavender plants in the Dower House garden had grown, in their absence, by a finger's breadth. Charlotte walked down to look at them before she changed her travelling dress, and Theodore, at the parlour window, watched her go. The first weeks of June at Ashwood passed quietly. The roses on the south wall came out. The orchard set its first true fruit. The seed Coles had saved from the flooded barn went into a small experimental plot at the corner of Hollow Field, and grew, against expectation, faster than the seed in the unflooded fields. The tenants completed the last of the spring repairs. The slates above the gallery, after their long century of neglect, held silent against 4 warm rains in succession. Lord Brackmore's last move came, with a kind of grim inevitability, on the morning of the 14th of June. It came in the form of a sealed packet, delivered to the great house at Ashwood Park by a clerk in a black coat, addressed jointly to the Duke of Ashwood and to the Lord Chancellor's office in London. It contained, as Theodore, breaking the seal, had expected it to contain, a notice of the Brackmore lienholder's intention to commence forfeiture proceedings on the 4th of July, on the grounds that the marriage contract, executed on the morning of the 8th of April, had been performed under conditions of material misrepresentation. He took the packet to Charlotte in the small parlour. She was at the writing desk, in a dress of pale lilac muslin, replying to a letter from her father. "It has come," he said. "Then we shall reply. Please sit down, Theodore. I have something to show you." She opened the second drawer of the writing desk. From it, she drew a thick folio bound in pale green ribbon.
She laid it on the desk in front of him. She untied the ribbon.
Read.
He read. He read for 11 minutes. He read in disbelief, and then in growing comprehension, and then in the particular silence of a man who has discovered, in the middle of his own house, an enormous and entirely unexpected piece of furniture. Charlotte had, in 3 months, quietly and without consultation, bought up the Brackmore lien. She had not bought it in her own name. She had bought it through 3 separate intermediaries in the city, the second of whom was a Mr. Vaughan Pell of Lombard Street, the late Mrs. Vaughan Pell's son, who had a long memory, a private fondness for Charlotte Merritt, and a healthy contempt for Lord Quentin Brackmore, using, for the first instalment, a small inheritance her mother had left in trust, and, for the subsequent instalments, the entirety of her quarterly allowance from the Asherwood estate, augmented by a private loan from Mrs. Vaughan Pell against the security of her own future income. She had been, since the morning after the wedding, the actual holder of 3/4 of the debt against which Lord Brackmore proposed to foreclose. She had not told Theodore. She had not told anyone except Mrs. Vaughan Pell, Mr. Vaughan Pell of Lombard Street, and her father. The remaining quarter, the part not yet in her name, had been, for the past 8 days, in Theodore's. He had bought it himself, on the advice of his solicitor at the end of May, and had not told her either, on the principle that it was an unromantic surprise. They sat in the parlour and looked at each other. Charlotte.
Theodore?
You bought up the Brackmore lien.
I bought 3/4 of it. You appear to have bought the rest.
I appear to have bought the rest. A pause. We, Theodore said carefully, own the entire Brackmore lien.
Yes.
Lord Brackmore cannot foreclose on a lien held by us.
He cannot.
Indeed, by the terms of the lien itself, we may now call it in, at our convenience, with 3 weeks' notice. He owes us, by my last calculation, rather more money than he possesses. Theodore began, for the second time in 2 months, to laugh. She watched him laugh. Her face was very composed, but her eyes were not, and her hand, on the green ribbon, was not entirely steady. He stopped laughing. He looked at her.
Charlotte, why did you not tell me?
At first, because I was not yet sure you would believe I was acting in good faith. Later, because I wished to be certain it would work. Last week, because I had, by then, kept the secret too long to know how to confess it gracefully. I am sorry, Theodore. It was not done to deceive you. It was done to protect you. A small breeze through the open window of the small parlour stirred the curtain. The June sunlight on the writing desk had reached the green ribbon of the folio and lay across it in 2 thin, warm bands. Outside, the gardeners on the south lawn were quietly raking the gravel. The sound carried in even strokes through the open sash. The lily of the valley, in the small porcelain bowl on the corner of the desk, smelled clean and faintly bridal. Somewhere in the kitchen wing, a clock chimed once for the half-hour and was answered, 3 rooms away, by the great gallery clock, which had not yet been mended, and which struck 5 and 3, and then, as if remembering the hour at last, 2 more. You used your inheritance. I used my inheritance. And your allowance. And my allowance. And a loan from Mrs. Vaughan Pell. Yes. Charlotte. Yes. I should like very much to thank you. I do not have, at the moment, the right words for it. Shall we walk down to the Dower House garden? Yes, she said. I should like that very much. They walked down together in the warm, bright light of a June morning. The lavender hedge that had been planned, sketched, and ordered in April was now in the ground. It had not yet flowered. It was the height, as yet, of 2 cupped hands. The jasmine over the south wall, planted the same week, was beginning to throw out the first long green tendrils. The Dower House door, freshly painted, had been hung that morning. The chimney smoked, very gently, against the soft June sky.
Mrs. Penny had ordered a kettle put on the hob inside, on the grounds that one never knew. Theodore stopped beside the line of small lavender plants. He took both Charlotte's hands. "Charlotte Merritt Asherwood," he said. "I came to my altar in April with a contract I had not read, and a wish I have only just understood. I wished for someone who would not look at me with pity. I have been given, instead, a wife who has saved my estate, organized my tenants, charmed my housekeeper, dispatched my cousin, and married me a second time today by a private deed of confidence I shall not, in this lifetime, repay. I shall do my best. Will you let me try?" "Theodore." "Yes." "You have not yet said it." "What?" "The thing one is supposed to say in such moments." A bee, drawn by the new lavender, traced a slow, tentative arc above the small green plants, and decided, after an investigative pass, to accept their existence. The June sky above the Dower House garden was the soft, true blue of a Sussex morning that would, by noon, have warmed to something deeper. Mrs. Penny's kettle, on the hob inside, made the small, soft sound a kettle makes in the half-hour before the boil. The gravel of the path was warm through the thin sole of Charlotte's slipper. Theodore could feel the pulse at his own throat against the high, white stock of his collar. Somewhere up the lawn, a dog barked once, and was answered by a pheasant in the home wood, and was then, with great firmness, hushed. "Charlotte, I love you, most foolishly, with the whole of my unsuitable, slow, stubborn heart. I have loved you, I think, since the morning of the wedding, when you put your hand on my sleeve in the carriage and said the words, 'manageable scandal,' as if they were an item on a grocer's list. I shall love you in September, when the harvest is brought in. I shall love you in November, when the hedges are cut. I shall love you in February, when the rain comes through the roof again, as it inevitably will. I shall love you, with very great pleasure, every spring from this one forward, for as many springs as we are given." "Theodore." "Yes." 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 "Yes. Most. Yes." She put her arms around his neck, in the garden of the Dower House, with the lavender no higher than a cupped hand, and the jasmine not yet flowering, and Mrs. Penny watching with grim satisfaction from the parlour window of the great house up the lawn, and the Duke kissed his Duchess, with a tenderness that the Duchess of Devonshire, had she been present, would have called slightly indecorous, and the Land Commissioner, had he been present, would have entered into his report under the heading of Evidence of Conjugal Harmony. The Brackmore lien was called in on the 18th of June. Lord Quentin Brackmore, having no means of paying it, withdrew first to a small estate in Yorkshire, and then, 8 months later, to Dieppe, where he was occasionally seen at the gambling tables and uniformly ignored. He did not return to Sussex. He did not attend the christening of the Asherwood heir in the spring of the following year, although he was sent a card. Eliza Merritt, having written first one and then a second careful letter, was received at Asherwood Park in early August. She arrived with a small valise and a great deal of contrition. Charlotte gave her a room in the south wing, employment as cataloguer of the Asherwood Library, and, over the next 4 years, a slow, recovered self-respect that surprised both cousins as much as it surprised everyone else. She did not marry the music master. She did, eventually, marry an estimable bookseller from Lewis, whose Christian name was unmemorable, but whose temperament was reliable. And at her wedding, the Duchess of Asherwood gave the bride away. Captain Charles Merritt of Petworth, who had received in late April a letter from his daughter that he had read 3 times before he understood it, came to live in the Dower House in September. He brought a pipe, a small library of naval memoirs, and a venerable spaniel named Pepys. He proved, to Mrs. Penny's mild astonishment, to be the most agreeable houseguest the Asherwood estate had received in 40 years. He took, with great satisfaction, to teaching his grandson, when the grandson arrived, to identify the constellations from the Dower House garden in winter. The Dower House garden flowered for the first time in late July. The lavender came up in 2 long blue waves. The jasmine, which had been tentative until midsummer,
threw itself across the south wall in a pale, fragrant cascade, and stayed there. Bess from Hollow Field, 10 years old by then, and the under-shepherd's chief assistant, was given the responsibility of cutting the lavender for the housekeeper on the first Thursday of every August, and discharged it with great solemnity for the remaining 16 years of her childhood and adolescence. The summer at Asherwood Park, in that first year of the new Duchess, settled into a rhythm of shared work and slow private intimacies that the household had not seen since the old Duke's young days. The hay was brought in across the south fields under a high blue sky in the second week of July. The orchard was thinned in late August. The bees, established in 3 new straw hives along the kitchen garden wall, surprised everyone by yielding a small quantity of pale clover honey before September. The dower house, by the end of the long, warm month, smelled inside of new paint and old beeswax and the cut lavender that Bess had brought up in armfuls. Outside, the stone walls were warm to the hand all day. The south window stood open from morning to dusk, and the single new chimney, against the original architect's drawings, but on the Duchess's specific instruction, drew sweetly even in the heaviest of the August storms. Captain Merritt's spaniel, arriving at the end of September in advance of his master, claimed the south-facing flagged terrace on the first afternoon, and did not afterwards permit any cat from the home farm to occupy it. Autumn arrived early at Asherwood that year. The harvest came in clean and full from the south fields by the 3rd week of September. The lime avenue turned, almost overnight, from heavy summer green to the soft pale gold the Duke's mother had loved, and had been particular about, a colour the gardeners measured against a pressed leaf she had kept, 60 years before, between the pages of a book of devotional poetry. The hedgerows in the lane to Hollow Field went over from white blossom to clusters of small red haws, and then, week by week, to the deep crimson of full ripeness. In the dower house garden, the lavender was cut a second time and bound into bundles for the linen presses. The jasmine, having flowered prodigiously, settled into its long second life as deep green leaf against warm stone. The small window pane at the head of the south staircase, which had rattled in every wind for as long as Mrs. Penny could remember, was at last replaced, and the new pane held silent through the first October gales, as if grateful to have been noticed. Mrs. Penny, in the housekeeper's room, allowed herself once a week, but no more often, as one must not lose discipline, to remark to the cook that Her Grace had done nicely, all things considered. The hawthorn in the lane to Hollow Field, white in April, was crimson with haws by the end of September. In the small parlour of the great house, on a thoughtful, golden, ordinary autumn evening, 3 months after the dower house garden had first come into bloom, 6 months and 12 days after the morning at St. Margaret by the Park, the Duke of Asherwood sat in the leather chair by the fire, with his wife on the arm of it, and the chatelaine of keys lay between them on the small table beside the lamp, and the great gallery clock, which had been mended, finally, after 116 years of irregularity, struck the hour cleanly, exactly 7 times, and was answered in the home wood, as the last note thinned to silence, by an owl whose voice they both, by then, recognized. Theodore. Yes? I have been thinking about your wish. Have you? You wished, you said, that the woman waiting at your altar would not look at you with pity. I did. I have not, I think, looked at you with pity, have I? No, he said. You have not. Good. I never shall. No, he said. Nor I you. She lifted the chatelaine of keys from the table, weighed it briefly in her hand, and put it back. The brass was cool. The iron was heavy. The small enamelled fob bearing the Asherwood crest had been polished, in the past 6 months, by a duchess's fingers, and had begun, very faintly, to brighten. She turned the conversation then to the matter of his original wish, the wish of which she had been thinking, off and on, since the first morning of their marriage. It had not, she said quietly, been the wrong wish. It had simply been a wish that had taken the unusual route of being answered by an entirely different woman than he had imagined. He thought about that for some time. Perhaps,
he answered at last. It had been the right wish all along. He had merely been mistaken about who it was for. She inclined her head. He rested his hand briefly over hers on the arm of the chair. Neither of them spoke for the better part of a minute. The fire settled a second time. The clock did not, this time, strike. The fire settled. The lamp burned low. Outside, in the Dower House garden, the first October frost was just beginning to settle on the second crop of lavender and the haws of the hawthorn at the gate, and a small light shone in the window of Captain Merritt's parlour, where he was, very probably, reading aloud to his spaniel from a naval memoir of 1798. In the gallery upstairs, the new slates held against the autumn rain that was, in its turn, just beginning to come on. The fire in the small parlour shifted again, the lamplight on the chatelaine of keys threw the small enamelled fob into low relief. The ashwood crest worn to a soft shine by the Duchess's fingers across 6 months of carrying. Outside the long window, the lime avenue was a corridor of pale gold against the deepening blue of the early evening. Beyond it, the Dower House chimney smoked thinly, evenly, in the still autumn air. A second owl, from the other side of the home wood, answered the first. The Duke and the Duchess sat together in the lamplight on a Tuesday evening in autumn, and had, between them, no further wish to make. If you have ever stepped into a room you were not invited to, and found the people inside more in need of you than they knew, or if you have ever made a wish for one woman, and discovered, by the most extraordinary accident, that you had been wishing all along for someone else entirely, tell me about it in the comments. I love hearing your stories. If you enjoyed this one, do consider subscribing. There will be another next week.